Hello there, people of the internet. This is an interesting topic for you guys, and one that I feel like people don't talk about very often, but they should talk about it. The main reason why people don't talk about this topic very often is just because most people, like the average person, doesn't shoot enough in order for this topic to be relevant. But we're going to be talking about barrel life today, or specifically how long a firearm will last. For the most part, barrel life is what most people look at whenever they're talking about how long a firearm will last, but there's other things as well. Normally, whenever a firearm has a fail point, it is the barrel getting worn out. That is most often the case. But before that happens, you might have issues with like springs, like buffer springs or recoil springs, just wearing out from compression cycles. You might have issues with worn extractors and ejectors because those are some of the harder worn parts on a firearm. You might maybe have some issues with bolts being worn depending on what it is that you're firing and the actual quality of the material that that particular thing is made of. But we're gonna go ahead and err on the side of like what most people are going to be using. Of course, if you want to go out and get yourself like some hyper expensive, extraordinarily durable, well-made custom piece of whatever it is that you're wanting to get, it's going to probably end up lasting longer than the generic factory-made thing that most people are going to end up going out to get whenever they go out to get whatever it is that they're needing to replace whatever part it is on their rifle that has ceased to exist. So whenever it comes to your barrel life of your firearm, we'll go ahead and we'll touch on this, and then we'll get into a little bit more of the other things that might wear out on a firearm. But barrel life is going to be the main thing, because once the barrel goes down, that's one of those things that on most platforms it's a little bit on the difficult side to swap out a barrel. Not all platforms, but most platforms. So typically what you're looking at whenever it comes to barrel life, you're looking at quality of the barrel, of course, but you're also looking at the pressures and velocities of the cartridge that is being fired out of that particular platform. Now, I do want to go ahead and just point this out right now. The AR platform, which most people are probably going to be familiar with if you're watching this video, it is entirely dependent on the quality of the manufacturer with these rifles. There's just so many different manufacturers out there that are producing so many different variations. If we're looking at like a budget tier, we're going to call it like $400 to $1,000 AR, odds are your barrel's going to end up lasting between 5 to 8,000 rounds, somewhere in there, before you start seeing some real significant spreads with your group size opening up just from the barrel getting worn out. The 5.56 round, which is what we're talking about here from the AR platform, there are other cartridges that you could chamber this platform in, but we're going to go ahead and rock the standard because that's what most people are going to be familiar with. The 5.56 platform, that right there is a 55 grain bullet from a full-length barrel moving about 3,200 feet per second, give or take, depending on brand and whatnot of the ammunition that you're using. From a 16-inch barrel, it's probably going to be more like 2,900, 3,000, somewhere in there. But that's still, although it is a little tiny bullet that's not all that heavy, that's still moving pretty gosh darn fast. And especially if we're rocking a platform like this where you can pull that trigger really, really fast and send a lot of lead downrange really quickly and heat up your barrel really rapidly, you can wear out those barrels rather quickly. So between 5 to 8,000 rounds for your bottom tier AR platforms, and if you have something a little bit better, say, I don't know, I know Daniel Defense barrels last for a pretty good long time. Just those like $1,000 and upper tiers, you're looking more like 10,000 to 15,000 rounds before you start to see a real diminishing accuracy. And even then, that diminishing accuracy that I'm talking about here is still well within the range of what most people are actually capable of. So if we have a 4 MOA shooter and they have a 2 MOA gun and they send 10,000 rounds of ammo through it and it opens up to a 4 MOA gun, then they're not even going to notice because they're already a 4 MOA shooter. Does that make sense? So we got this tiny bullet moving quite fast, but if we move on to other cartridges that have, say, probably a little less of a barrel life than that right there, based off of velocities and bullet weight and the pressures that are achieved and whatnot. If we look at something like, say, what's another one that people are very familiar with? 6.5 Creedmoor. With the 6.5 Creedmoor, you get probably about 3,000 to 5,000 rounds of ammo through that thing. I can't quite remember the velocities on that. I think it's a 140 grain bullet moving approximately 26, maybe 2,700 feet per second. I could be wrong on that, but I think that's about the ballpark, because that's about the ballpark of what you get with 6.5 Swede. I know they're very ballistically similar. But the 6.5 Creedmoor, that's a heavier bullet. It's moving quite fast. You got quite a lot of pressures in that thing. It's a short action cartridge, kind of like how the 308 was a shorter version of the 30-06 that still achieved the same capabilities with better powder and higher pressures and things like that in comparison to the M2 ball round. The 6.5 Creedmoor kind of does that same exact thing in comparison to your larger 30 caliber rounds. Something like a 308 barrel in comparison to that 6.5 Creedmoor. Your 308 barrel, that's going to generally last, we're going to call it around 10,000 or so rounds. So probably about twice the barrel length of your 6.5 Creedmoor. Again, most people probably are not going to be reaching these points, but that is about the barrel life that you're going to be expecting from a 308 rifle. Maybe with your better tier, better quality 308 rifles, you might squeeze out 15,000 rounds, but you're looking at about that ballpark. Now, if we start looking at something like, here's a good example. If we start looking at something like an AK, the barrel life on these right here is phenomenally long. The AK, this is a 123 grain bullet, so it's a 30 caliber bullet, but it's not very heavy for a 30 caliber round. 123 grain bullet, moving about 2,300 feet per second, give or take, maybe a little bit lower or a little bit slower if we have a shorter barrel length or something like that. But somewhere around that ballpark. And the Russian, like their designated barrel life, the Romanian designated barrel life, the Chinese designated barrel life for all their 7.62 by 39 stuff, the minimum is like 30,000 rounds before you start seeing a diminishing accuracy. And I've seen them last all the way up to 50,000 rounds. So you can get a lot of rounds with this lighter weight, slower moving 30 caliber projectile than you could say out of a 308 or something like that. Lower pressures, lower velocities, lower everything. It just has less wear on the gun, which makes sense because there's less power coming out of the gun. Now, if we do look at something more like, actually, this is a really good example. Give me that. If we look at something like this right here, this is a percussion cap rifled musket, so it's a muzzle loader, and this right here fires black powder. Black powder is quite corrosive, and assuming that you don't leave the black powder inside of the firearm to sit there and corrode the barrel and whatnot, then these right here can last quite a long time, especially if we're talking about a modern made one with modern manufacturing and whatnot. But this is a good segue to barrel life, because if you fire something corrosive out of your gun, like I've got 8mm Mausers and 303s and 7.62 by 54Rs and even 7.62 by 39s. A lot of this stuff can be corrosive. And what that means is that whenever you shoot your gun, there's going to be some kind of salt inside of either the powder or the priming compound, depending on what it is that we're talking about. And that inside of your barrel is going to cause it to rust. So you have to wash out your barrel and get all that crap out of there. Oftentimes people use hot water, but you could use ammonia or Windex. I know that works good because it's got ammonia in it. Any kind of thing that you can use to dissolve the salts is kind of what you would want to use to wash down, because that corrosive stuff inside your barrel causes it to rust, and that rust dramatically diminishes your barrel life. Like, if your barrel is just rusting away, that's not wear from friction from rounds going through it. That is like corrosion. That is the barrel being literally destroyed from corrosion. And I mean, you could just like shoot a handful of rounds and then lean your gun up against a wall and leave it there for a couple of weeks, and then you would have no longer any usable barrel left in that thing. So, assuming that we're talking about, you know, non-corroded or non-corrosive ammo, then you should get at least a few thousand rounds out of even the most intensive rifles. Like if we start looking at something like really big and really powerful, like what's a good barrel burner? Like a really good barrel burner. I think 28 Nosler is probably the best barrel burner that I can think of. You're lucky to get 2,000 rounds out of something like that, but to go out and fire 2,000 rounds from a 28 Nosler, that's a lot. That's a lot of a lot. Now, if we start looking at something more like this right here, this is a handgun. Handgun cartridges, like the actual rounds that come out of a handgun, they can be quite heavy. Like I know 45 ACP is a 230 grain bullet, but oftentimes these are operating at significantly lower pressures than most of your rifle rounds. Now, I do say that because there's some pretty low pressure rifle rounds out there, but by a huge margin, rifle rounds are going to have more pressure than your pistol rounds. So the actual projectile size and the actual projectile weight and the actual caliber and whatnot, that doesn't necessarily matter, because the 45 ACP, that's a, well, from a barrel length that is approximately the length of a 1911, that's a 230 grain bullet moving about 800 to 850 feet per second, somewhere in that ballpark. You may see them chronographed at 750, which is not uncommon from that shorter barrel length, but it's supposed to be about 800 to 850 out of the 1911 platform. But that's a large bullet. That's a heavy bullet, but the barrels on something like that just last a very, very long time because the velocity is low and the pressures are low. Same thing with something like 40 Smith & Wesson, which is what I have right here. Same thing with 9mm. Same thing with insert your choice of handgun cartridge here. They're just not overly powerful, and so as a result, they're not really going to burn out your barrel all that much. I have seen Glocks at places who rent them out, and they'll have hundreds, like several hundreds of thousands of rounds through their Glocks, and the barrels are still fine. And that's just because of the nature of 9mm, or the nature of just pistol caliber cartridges in general. They don't really burn out barrels all that much. Now again, where you might start to see wear on something like that is recoil springs. You might see firing pin wear because that firing pin smacks a primer every single time that you fire the thing. And you might see extractor and ejector issues as well, just because those are wearable parts. Even without all the pressures and whatnot inside of the cartridge, every time you pull that trigger, assuming that we're firing a semi-automatic handgun or semi-automatic rifle or whatever, those are still going to operate and move, and they have springs and whatnot that have compression cycles that go through them every single time that you pull the trigger. And although, yes, more powerful cartridges will likely have a more potent wear on those systems, it's not going to be a significant difference just because of the way that most of your firearms are designed in terms of gas pressures and how fast recoil systems actually operate, etc., etc. But that's probably a topic for another time. I know that whenever it comes to extractors and ejectors and things like that, your self-loading semi-automatic firearms like your AR, your AK, various handguns, etc., etc., are going to wear out significantly faster than something like a bolt-action rifle. Where is a good bolt-action rifle that is easy for me to get my hands on? I guess we'll go ahead and grab my sporterized Enfield right here. But with something like this right here, you pull the trigger, it goes bang. Unlike something like a semi-auto, which cycles the action very violently and launches that round out, although you could, like, very strongly pull this back and try to launch that cartridge as fast as you can, the odds of you achieving that same velocity from those gas pressures is quite low. There's a reason why your bolt-action rifles tend to last significantly longer in terms of parts wear than something like a semi-auto. These right here are definitely more bulletproof in that guise. So this was a fun little discussion. I enjoyed talking about, well, how guns wear out, I guess. Most of the time people are looking at barrel life, but if you manage to fire a gun to the point to where something else on the firearm breaks, like your extractor, ejector, all the springs and whatnot, which are more likely to wear out than your barrel life, then that might be something that you have to look into replacing. Now, if we're looking at other things that are just because of cheap manufacturing, like if we have ourselves a bottom tier AK and you start seeing rivets beginning to shear off, or maybe headspace starts walking because our barrel pin right here maybe is not made of as good of material as it's supposed to be, so it's deforming. You start having issues with your AK. I mean, there's other things that can wear out on a gun just because of lower cost, lower tier manufacturing workarounds or shortcuts or things like that. And I mean, that could be complete conjecture as far as that goes, because anything can happen with that. So that right there might make a fun video in itself, talking about, you know, things that can go wrong with your bottom tier firearms versus things that are a little bit more well made. Most of the things I have are military surplus, so they're pretty gosh darn well made. So thanks for watching. Appreciate your time. Like, subscribe, share. Description below is a link to all sorts of stuff. Go check it out. You guys go off, have yourself a fantastic day. I'll see you on the next episode. Been a little while since I've done this. Bonnie and Clyde be damned. The poor man's Garen. It's a shame that bolt action shotguns aren't more mainstream.